Hello and welcome to the summing up of Arab Jazz, the last book on the course. Right, I've sent you a couple of links about this, which I think give interesting background on this guy, helps you to see where he's coming from. He was born, just briefly, he was born in 1954. Was it? No, 64, I think, sorry, 64 in Mauritania. And his father is a Mauritanian diplomat, his mother was French, but has spent most of his life in France, in Paris, and from what he says, feels completely French. But he's also, I think, beset by the problem of identity, where he belongs, and this comes through, I think, in this book, particularly in the character of Ahmed. But to start, I think, first of all, with one of the quotes I gave you that from one of his interviews, in which he said, "For me, crime writing is the best way to put something in the world in front of a mirror." An interesting comment, and I think this kind of takes us to the heart of the issue, I think, with this book, to which some people have reacted very strongly, in that he suggests that using the phrase "like a mirror" suggests this is a kind of reflection of the way in which he sees the society that he's living in. And he finds crime writing the most compatible genre, whereby to convey his comments, his thoughts, his sentiments about the world in which he's living. So it's a genre book in the way that we actually haven't encountered in the previous books. And a number of you have said to me, well, I don't really read crime books anyhow. But another quote from Miske, he says, "I think the barrier which exists in some people's minds between the thriller and literature is false." He's not just writing he is just writing a crime writing book, but it's a crime writing book, I think, which has got a fairly serious purpose, and it's the way in which he chooses to put out his convey his ideas on society, on all the things that the really big problems that happen in a multicultural city. But briefly, crime books, detective books, have we encountered these in our course before? I think probably an interesting link with our last book, Modiano, which Modiano's books do read rather like detective stories, but they're detective stories which lack any kind of resolution. It's all about the quest rather than the resolution, and the denouement is normally anything less than definite. Whereas we do have a denouement here. We have a proper kind of follow through, finding the killers, etc., etc. But it's not a total all is well with the world kind of denouement at all. As he said in one of the interviews, he sees the essential, kind of very abstract concept, I suppose, of evil in the world as something that's ineradicable. We'll never get rid of it, and this is very much the implication at the end of the book. So he is very much, then, this is why I put on the course, he's writing the contemporary world. In a way, I was looking for something which dealt with the modern global multicultural city. And it's a sort of counterpart, I suppose, to Zadie Smith's White Teeth at the end of the first part of our course. Although, of course, that was primarily in comic mode. And although she was very much putting it into fictional form, the problems of multicultural societies, her overall message was we can get along, as it were, which is not really the message we were getting from Arab jazz. So a different mode, but talking probably about similar issues in modern cities. His depiction of the city, again, we might compare with Modiano, where there was a lot of detail about street names and buildings and so on and so forth. Rather less of it, strangely, in this book. It's based on one particular arrondissement. And he tells us a lot about the different people living there, but there's not really very much descriptive detail I found about streets or buildings or public places or whatever. There is a lot of detail, though, and the detail is almost the detail that a filmmaker, which of course Miskay is, would use. It's very much to do with what people eat, what people drink, which bars they go into, what clothes they're wearing. I mean, we know what trainers all the criminals are wearing. It's this kind of very specific everyday material detail which gives us, I think, the flavour of the city of Paris that Miskay wants to convey. It's a character-driven book in a way, and he said this in his interview. He does identify with Ahmed, who is a rather sympathetic character. He is fairly spaced out at the beginning, and the book, in a way, is how he comes to terms with the real world. As he moves out of the fictional world of crime fiction. I mean, like his author, like his creator, he is obsessed by crime fiction. So it's a nice sort of bit of metafiction going on here, in which the character who is obsessed by crime fiction then takes on, as it were, the role of a detective. So Ahmed is our hero in a way. We're sort of gunning for Ahmed as we go through the narrative, and we hope. I mean, he's being set up for the crime by the band of nasties, but he's okay. I mean, he becomes, as it were, one of these sort of the two detectives in charge of the case don't believe that he is a likely criminal, and it ends in maybe a somewhat romanticized, I don't know how believable way, in which he's flying off for a holiday with one of the detectives at the end. Criticisms, I think you could say there is a bit too much noir in this. Do we need quite so many noir episodes? And they are extremely noir. Is he over-egging the cake? Do we need, as another band of extremists, the Jehovah's Witnesses? We've already got several others. Do we need the Barnes twins and the Brooklyn section? It seems he is throwing everything into the mix, and you wonder whether a bit of editing might have made it a kind of well, do we want an easy read? No, it would have changed it. I think it's possibly a one-off book in that he wrote it in 2012. As far as I know, there are no other novels in the offing, and perhaps he's just gone back to filmmaking. It's very much a film script, I think, and I found it very reminiscent of the Coen brothers films, with that particular brand of violence and black humor. The characterization of Ahmed is, I think, he's a credible character, as are the two detectives. Then we've got a whole band of baddies, some of whom I think are rather more caricature type figures, and then figures who seem not really into it at all. I mean, the police chief Mercator, who is a kind of guru type figure who sits there doodling circles and speaking about evil and so on and so forth. But somehow the author does manage to tie up all the threads, and it's a good read. I think it's a good page-turning read. Um, Issues of identity, another quote I gave you, which he said himself: when you are an Arab in France, the question of identity is always there, and you have to confront it one way or another. So I think Miske himself is very much aware of questions of people's need to belong, people's need to define an identity, whether through a religious group or your patriotism or whatever. So he's coming to his story from something that he is well aware of and something he knows very well. Some people commented very much a first novel. Well, he said there haven't been any other novels from him, so it is a first and maybe a last. Dialogue sometimes a bit awkward. He sometimes gives us a bit too much information, as it were, rather than it's the classic case of telling us rather more than showing us, which can be less effective. But I think it's, despite the violence, despite the very graphic violence and really horrific detail, I found it a fascinating read. I think, like some of you, I had considerable resistance to it at the start, but I was glad to have read it, and I think it made an interesting conclusion to the French part of our course, which has taken us all the way from the early mid-19th century Balzac up to the 21st century Paris. So essentially that is goodbye to the course. Just a few words about the theme of the course in general. We've taken two major cities, London and Paris, and I've really, in my choice of books, tried to find texts which were reflecting and commenting on contemporary life in these cities, so to give us in a way a sort of panoramic view. But there is a distinction, I think, to be made between the 19th century authors and the more modern authors. The 19th century authors, Dickens, Balzac, Zola, I think are able to read the city, to make the city more legible in a way that our modern authors refrain, I think quite rightly, from doing, in that the city now is more harder to read. It's more fragmented, and so we get kind of fragmented texts. I mean, as early as Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway, and there are some interesting parallels, I think, to be made between Virginia Woolf's technique and Modiano's work. They're both a kind of form of psychogeography, cities of the mind. So we have different focus, and Balzac, Zola very much making a comment on their societies, looking back, in each case retrospectively, but feeling that they are in a position to give an overall panoramic view, which modern authors are much less able to do. In our last few books, Simone de Beauvoir very much, it's a philosophic novel, but written during the occupation, so I think of particular interest historically. All these books are making some kind of comment on our society, for better or worse. And I think really this is what the novelist should do in many ways. I think the novelist should reflect and write about the society in which they live, and take us along with them, which in most cases I think these authors have very much succeeded in doing. So that's it, and thank you to those of you particularly who have given me feedback along the way, which has been all helpful and interesting. And I wish you well over the summer, and hope you'll be able to meet up face to face in the autumn.